The record was still open on Arbiter Thesavane's desk when the first report arrived. Not a war report, not a diplomatic communique, something smaller and therefore more disturbing, an inventory discrepancy from a minor resupply station near the outer drift, a region so economically irrelevant that the Council hadn't formally acknowledged it in 11 years. The discrepancy was 3 lines long. A shipment of medical-grade coagulants, origin unlisted, a quantity that suggested either catastrophic wastage or catastrophic need. And a receiving signature that didn't belong to any registered faction. The signature read simply, Terran Auxiliary Corps. Thesavane stared at that phrase for a long time. Humanity had been formally expelled from the Galactic Council 4 years ago. They had no auxiliary corps. They had no recognized military designation. They had, according to every legal framework the Council had spent 18 months constructing specifically to contain them, no right to operate in any registered star system, conduct any interstellar commerce, or bear any organizational title that implied governmental structure. And yet, 3 lines, a resupply station, medical coagulants. Thesavane closed the file, then opened it again, then reached across the desk and pressed the activation glyph for her secure communicator with a deliberateness that suggested she already knew, somewhere beneath the procedural calm of her training, that the 3 lines were not the beginning of something. They were the end of a very long silence. The banishment vote had passed with 91% council approval, which was, by any historical measure, extraordinary. The council had existed for 600 years. It had expelled precisely 2 member civilizations in that time, and both expulsions had required decades of procedural negotiation, conditional frameworks, and structured re-entry pathways. Humanity's expulsion had taken 11 days. They are a destabilizing variable, Arbiter Prime Kalvorath had said, and the chamber had agreed with the speed of something that had been decided long before the session began. Their military doctrine is opaque. Their diplomatic signals are internally contradictory. They respond to treaty obligations selectively and justify the selection post hoc with philosophical frameworks that are, frankly, untranslatable. We cannot build a stable galactic order around a species that does not behave consistently. What Kalvorath did not say, because it was understood by every delegate in the chamber without needing to be spoken. Humanity frightened them, not because humans were powerful. In terms of raw fleet capacity, resource extraction, and technological sophistication, humanity ranked somewhere in the lower third of council members. The Vreth Dominion alone could field 7 times the tonnage of the entire Terran defense fleet. What frightened them was something harder to quantify. Humanity's representative, a woman named Alina Vasquez, had sat through the entire 11-day proceeding without once raising her voice. She had answered every procedural challenge with precise, cooperative responses. She had offered compromises. She had asked clarifying questions about the legal framework being constructed to contain her species with what appeared to be genuine intellectual interest. And on the final day, as the vote was being formalized, she had said only one thing that wasn't procedural. "You're making an assumption," she said. Kalvorath, already moving toward the ceremonial closure of the session, paused. "Representative Vasquez, the vote is concluded." "I know," she said. "I'm not contesting it. I'm just nodding for the record that you're making an assumption about what we'll do next. And I want that noted because in a few years I think the record will matter." Kalvorath had regarded her with the particular brand of contempt that functions as a mask for unease. The record will show that humanity was offered every opportunity to conform to galactic standards and declined. "Yes," Vasquez said, "it will show that too." She left without ceremony. The council moved on, 11 days start to finish. 4 years later, Thesavane pulled every report that mentioned Earth, Terran activity, or human-adjacent operations in the outer drift, and discovered that the inventory discrepancy was not an anomaly. It was the first thing she'd noticed. The pattern, once she was looking for it, was everywhere. 15 separate resupply stations across 3 non-council systems had logged unexplained resource movements over the past 2 years. Medical supplies almost universally. But also, and this was where Thesavane's composure began to develop its first small fracture structural repair materials, water reclamation components, and in 4 instances, seed stock for agricultural ecosystems. The quantities weren't military. They weren't economic. They were, she realized slowly, *relief quantities. The kind of volume you'd send to a population experiencing crisis. She pulled the population data for the non-council systems. Every single one of them was experiencing crisis. The Karath expanse had been hit by a succession cascade from a destabilized binary star. A natural event, nothing the Council was responsible for, and nothing the Council had allocated response resources toward, because non-Council systems weren't eligible for humanitarian protocol. The Dravani stations had suffered an infrastructure collapse after their primary trade partner, a Council member, had restructurally redirected shipping lanes following a tariff negotiation that had nothing to do with them. The outer colonies of the Sulith Range had experienced 3 years of increasingly desperate requests to the Council for emergency agricultural support, all of which had been logged, processed, and respectfully deferred pending budget allocation review. Humanity had no budget. Humanity had no official standing. Humanity had been legally stripped of the right to conduct interstellar operations. Humans were everywhere. "I don't understand," said her assistant Prathik when she laid the pattern out for him. He was young, efficient, and had grown up with the Council's official narrative of the human expulsion as historical fact rather than living memory. If they're not receiving payment, and they're not registered, and they're not building political relationships with these systems, what are they doing it for? Thesavane didn't answer immediately. She was looking at a secondary file she'd just opened, medical incident reports from the Karath expanse, cross-referenced with human personnel presence. "Prathik," she said, "what do you know about human physiology?" He blinked. "General curriculum. They're carbon-based, bilaterally symmetrical, significantly less durable than the galactic median, shorter lifespan, higher vulnerability to radiation exposure, atmospheric variance, temperature extremes." "Yes," she said, "all of that. Now tell me why 6 of the human relief workers in the Karath expanse have filed medical reports indicating radiation exposure consistent with extended work in the collapse zone of a destabilized binary star, and why those same workers are listed as * currently active in the next station's relief roster." Prathik was quiet for a moment. They should be in recovery. Radiation exposure at that level requires months, Thesavane said, minimum for most species. "For most species," Prathik repeated slowly. "I want a full biological cross-reference," she said. "I want to know exactly what the human pain tolerance range looks like against the galactic median. I want to know what their documented recovery rate is from various injury categories. And I want it done quietly, because I don't think the Council has actually looked at this data in any serious way since the expulsion, and I want to understand what we're looking at before anyone else starts asking questions." What she didn't say, what she was only beginning to feel as a cold, careful dread at the base of her thoughts, was the third thing she'd noticed in the file. Not the medical supplies, not the human presence. The third thing was what wasn't there. There were no human ships in the registry. They were moving across star systems. They were delivering supplies. They were working in collapse zones. And they were doing all of it without a single registered vessel appearing in any Council-monitored transit lane. Which meant either humanity had developed a method of interstellar travel that was entirely invisible to Council sensors, which was technological sophistication so far beyond their assessed capacity as to be nearly impossible, or someone inside the council was helping them. The question was which option was more frightening. Thesivane filed a formal inquiry 3 days later. Routed through a procedural channel obscure enough that it wouldn't reach Kalvorath's office automatically, she asked for a full status audit of Earth's post-expulsion activity. The response came back in 6 hours, file sealed, Arbiter Prime jurisdiction, inquiry declined. She stared at that response for a long time. Prathik appeared in her doorway. He had the particular expression of someone who had found something while following instructions and was now uncertain whether to be excited or afraid. "The biological cross-reference," he said. "Tell me." He entered the room and placed a data slate on her desk without sitting down. Human pain tolerance sits at approximately 400% of galactic median. Their recovery rate from tissue damage is the framing in the original assessment is that it's remarkable for a species of their durability class, which means the people who wrote the assessment were still thinking about them as fragile. But when you run the actual numbers against comparable species, he stopped. Prathik. They heal faster than species with twice their baseline durability. And the literature suggests, this is old literature, mostly from the early contact period, that humans have a documented neurological response to extreme stress that actually increases performance rather than degrading it. Most species, when they reach a certain threshold of physical or psychological strain, begin to shut down. Conserve. Retreat. Humans don't, Thesivane said. Humans get more dangerous, he said quietly. The assessors flagged it as an anomaly and moved on. It's in a footnote arbiter. She picked up the slate, read the footnote, set it down. How long have we known this? The literature is 40 years old. 40 years, she said, and nobody, she stopped, breathed. Nobody thought this was relevant to the expulsion proceedings. Apparently not. This was the first time Thesivane understood that the Council had not banished humanity because it understood humans poorly. It had banished humanity because it understood humans the way you understand a storm, by its visible effects, never by its actual nature. The question forming at the edge of her thoughts now wasn't what are humans doing in the outer drift. The question, the real question she was only now putting into language, was, what has 4 years of complete freedom from institutional constraint done to them? She didn't know, and the file was sealed. The Sulith Range contacted the Council 14 days after Thesivane's inquiry was declined. Not a formal diplomatic contact. The Sulith had no formal diplomatic standing, being a non-council system. It was a citizen transmission, routed through commercial channels. A voice recording from a regional administrator named Gareth Soldravani, speaking in accented but fluent galactic standard, addressed to no one in particular, which was the specific form of address you used when you wanted something heard but couldn't risk it being intercepted on a direct line. "I want to note," Gareth Soldravani said, "for anyone who might be listening, that our agricultural collapse has been resolved. We were told 12 months ago that we were looking at complete ecosystem failure within 18 months. We would like to acknowledge carefully the parties responsible for that not happening." He paused. In the pause there was background sound, wind, voices, something mechanical in the far distance. "The people who came," he said, "worked for 3 months without leaving. The atmospheric conditions here they're genuinely harmful. You probably know that. Most of the species we'd asked for help had listed atmospheric toxicity as a disqualifying factor. The people who came listed it as a significant challenge to be managed. They went through 17 supply rotations of hazard mitigation equipment because the equipment kept wearing out in conditions it wasn't rated for. They never stopped. 2 of them were hospitalized. I don't know the details. They were quiet about it, and both of them were back on site within a week. I asked one of them why. Another pause longer. She said, "Because we're not done yet." Like that was the obvious answer. Like any other answer would have required more explanation than it was worth. The transmission ended there. Thesivane listened to it 4 times. Each time she caught something new in the pauses. The way Gareth Soldravani's voice did something careful and controlled when he described the workers going back after hospitalization. The absence of gratitude that was actually deeper than gratitude. He was frightened, she realized, not of the humans, of what the humans' behavior implied about the rest of the galaxy. She sent the recording to Prathik with one annotation. Find out how many other settlements are transmitting variations of this. Don't use council channels. His response came back in 2 hours, 47 confirmed, still counting. The thing that broke Kalvorath's confidence was not a fleet, it was not a weapon, it was a map. Thesivane had spent 6 weeks building it in silence, using commercial data, citizen transmissions, cross-referenced medical reports, and supply chain irregularities, all of which were technically public record and therefore not covered by the file seal. When she finally had it in full, she called a private session with 3 other arbiters she trusted, not Kalvorath's allies, not members of the bloc that had driven the expulsion vote. She projected the map onto the session chamber wall. It showed 31 non-council systems, and in each one, a Terran operational presence, relief workers, agricultural restoration teams, structural engineers, medical personnel. In several systems, long-term embedded advisors who had apparently been helping local governments build more resilient infrastructure for over a year. This is current, she said, as of last week. Arbiter Salvin, who had been on the original expulsion committee, leaned forward slowly. They're building a network. No, Thesivane said. That's the assumption I made at first. Look at the pattern. There's no centralized logistics hub. There's no unified command structure. There's no consistent communication protocol between sites. They're not building a network. They're building relationships. Individually, one system at a time. Each of these operations appears to have been initiated locally by humans who were already in the region, responding to the immediate crisis they encountered. That's not a strategy, Salvin said. That's chaos. Is it? Thesivane pressed a control, and the map updated. Lines appeared, connecting not human operations to each other, but human-assisted systems to their nearest neighbors. After the Sulith agricultural restoration, Sulith became a transit point for materials moving to the Karath expanse. After the Karath structural work, Karath opened its medical facilities to populations from 2 adjacent systems. After the Dravani stations were stabilized, they began hosting council-excluded traders from 3 other regions, creating a secondary commercial circuit that doesn't touch any council-monitored trade lane. The chamber was very quiet. They're not building a network, Thesivane said again. We are watching a network build itself, because humans went to every broken place in the outer galaxy and fixed things without asking for anything in return. And then the fixed things started connecting to each other, because that's what fixed things do. Arbiter Mendrethi, the oldest member of the session, said, "What does Elena Vasquez know about this?" "I don't know," Thesivane said, "but I need to find out. Because in 4 years, humanity has gone from being a lower third council member with no formal allies and a destabilizing diplomatic reputation, to being the only power in the outer systems that anyone trusts. And we did that to them. We handed them the motivation, the freedom, and the moral clarity. We gave them 4 years with no institutional obligation and no political constraint. And we apparently never asked ourselves what humans do when they have nothing left to lose but each other." Mendrethi was quiet for a long time. "What do you want to do?" "I want to talk to Vasquez," Thesivane said, "before Kalvorath finds this map." Elena Vasquez was on Karath Station 7 when Thesivane reached her. Not in an office, not in a diplomatic facility. The comm signal Thesivane's team had managed to route through after 4 days of deliberate indirection connected to a station medical wing, and the background noise was unmistakable. The low hum of life support equipment, the distant sound of voices in several languages, the specific quality of air filtration working harder than it was designed to. Arbiter Thesivane, Vasquez said. She didn't sound surprised. I wondered when you'd call. You knew we were looking. I knew someone was. You were thorough enough that I figured it was someone with a conscience. A pause and a different sound, something being moved, a chair adjusted. Are you calling on behalf of the council? No. Are you recording this conversation for the council? No. Then what do you want, Arbiter? Thesivane had prepared several versions of this conversation. She discarded all of them. I want to understand what you're doing, not the operations. I can see those. I want to understand the plan, because I don't see one, and that frightens me more than if I could see one. Vasquez was quiet long enough that Thesivane began to think the connection had dropped. There isn't a plan, Vasquez said finally. That's not an answer. No, I mean, Vasquez stopped. When she spoke again, her voice was different, less controlled, more precise, like someone who had been waiting to say something correctly for a long time. What we're doing isn't a strategy. It wasn't designed. It wasn't coordinated at the top and implemented downward. We got expelled. And then we had people, our people, who were already stationed in the outer systems, who had already built relationships there, who woke up the next morning and looked at the people around them and thought, well, we still have to eat. And so do they. And that wall fell on their settlement last week. Let's fix the wall. And then it spread, Thesivane said. People talk, Vasquez said. Especially desperate people. Word got out that humans would come when you called and wouldn't leave until the job was done. We'd been doing that for 100 years inside the council and nobody noticed, because there was always a committee meeting to attend and a budget allocation to process and a political relationship to maintain. When you took all of that away from us, she stopped. You kept doing it, Thesivane said quietly, without the committees. We didn't know how to stop, Vasquez said. That's the honest answer. The ones who went to Sulith, to Karath, they weren't following orders. They went because people were going to die if nobody went. And humans have. A brief pause, and in it Thesivane heard the thing she hadn't been able to name. We have difficulty with that, watching people die when we could have gone. Is that a cultural value? No, Vasquez said. I think it might just be a flaw. Thesivane had 17 hours before the map she'd built became discoverable through conventional audit channels. She spent the first 3 hours in the data archive, pulling the complete record of human diplomatic interactions over the past 60 years, looking for the thing she'd missed the first time she'd looked. It took 2 hours to find it. It wasn't in the diplomatic files. It was in the economic ones, specifically, in the trade impact assessments that the Council's Economic Bureau had been running every 6 months as a routine measure for the past decade. Dry documents, full of numbers, produced by analysts who cared about supply chains and cared nothing about the narrative those chains implied. For 60 years, every system that had experienced a significant economic or ecological crisis and that had received substantial human assistance had shown a consistent pattern. A 12 to 18-month period of recovery followed by a dramatic increase in productivity, not returning to pre-crisis baseline, exceeding it, by margins that the economic analysts had flagged dutifully as statistically notable and then moved on. 60 years of data, 31 systems, not one had failed to recover after substantial human involvement. Perthik, she said. He appeared immediately. He'd been waiting. Get me the Kalvorath block's voting record on the non-council system, aid requests from the past 3 years. He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Arbiter. Every request, she said, every deferral, every budget allocation that didn't happen, map them against my operational map. He did. It took 4 minutes. Every system humanity was currently operating in had filed at least 2 formal aid requests with the Council before humanity arrived. Most had filed 6 or more. Every request had been deferred, declined, or absorbed into a review process with no resolution timeline. She looked at the map for a long time. They went where we failed, she said, mostly to herself. Specifically, only where we failed. She didn't know whether that was intentional. Whether Elena Vasquez, in that chamber 4 years ago, had said "you're making an assumption because she already knew this was coming, or whether it had simply happened because humans went to broken places, and the Council had left so many places broken. Either answer was, in its own way, more unsettling than the other. Calvarath called an emergency session 18 hours later. He had the map. He hadn't gotten it from Thesavane's files. He had his own analysts, his own channels, and 4 years of ignoring the problem hadn't made him blind to it, only slow. He stood at the center of the chamber with the projection behind him and the collective weight of the Council's discomfort pressing inward from every corner of the room. "This," he said, "is an act of deliberate political subversion. Humanity has used its expulsion as cover to construct an influence network in non-council space, bypassing every legal restriction we imposed, and building de facto alliances with systems that are now economically dependent on continued Terran involvement. This is not relief work. This is colonization through obligation." The chamber was loud with agreement. It was the kind of agreement that comes from fear, which is indistinguishable from conviction until it has to be tested. Thesavane waited. She had been in council chambers for 30 years. She knew the specific moment when the loudest argument in the room began to feel, even to the people making it, slightly hollow. "Arbiter Prime," she said, when the noise had begun to thin. "You've characterized this as subversion. I'd like to ask one clarifying question for the record." Calvarath looked at her with the familiar contemptuous composure. "The record is open. Of the 31 systems on this map," she said, "how many had filed aid requests with the Council prior to receiving Terran assistance?" Silence. "I have the number if you'd like it," she offered. "This is not relevant to." "All of them," she said. "Every single one. We declined every single request. Some of them multiple times." She let that sit. "So the question I would like the record to reflect is, did humanity colonize these systems through obligation, or did they simply arrive when we didn't?" The chamber was very quiet. "We cannot reward treaty violation," Calvarath said, and his voice had changed, harder, flatter, which is what a voice does when its owner knows the room has shifted and is unwilling to show it. "Regardless of the humanitarian framing, the legal reality is." "The legal reality," Mendrethi said, speaking for the first time, "is that we constructed a legal framework specifically to contain a species that frightened us, and then we are surprised to discover that the species continued existing and behaving according to its nature on the other side of that framework." He was very old. He did not sound angry. He sounded like someone who had watched the same mistake be made before and was measuring the size of the current version carefully. "I was on the committee, Calvarath. I voted yes. And I was wrong. Not because the vote was illegal, because the vote assumed that if we removed humanity from the structure, they would stop doing what they do. I do not think we understood what they do." "We understood perfectly," Calvarath began. "No," Thesavane said, quietly. "We understood how they behaved in the context of the Council. We understood their bureaucratic dysfunction and their diplomatic inconsistency and their philosophical opacity. We had no idea what they would do when you took all of that away." She paused. "I spoke to Elena Vasquez 3 days ago." The room's temperature, metaphorically speaking, dropped. "Unofficially," she continued, "not on behalf of the Council, I asked her what the plan was. She told me there wasn't one. She told me that humans in the outer systems woke up after the expulsion and looked at the people dying around them and couldn't stop themselves from trying to help. She said," Thesavane stopped. What Vasquez had said was, "I think it might just be a flaw." She decided not to quote it. "Some things landed harder when they weren't weaponized." She described it as an inability. "Not a strategy." Calvarath's voice was perfectly controlled. That is a diplomatic performance. Is it? Thesivane brought up a secondary file. I'm looking at medical records from Karath Station 7. 11 human workers treated for radiation exposure, chemical burns, atmospheric toxicity complications, and in 2 cases, structural trauma from collapse events. Every single one returned to active operations within 8 days. The galactic median recovery time for those combined injury categories is, conservatively, 3 months. She closed the file. I am finding it difficult to characterize that as performance. The vote that followed was not unanimous. It was 63%. Still a majority, but a different kind of majority, the kind that contains doubt. The Council extended formal diplomatic recognition to the Terran Auxiliary Corps Asterisk as a registered humanitarian organization, which was not the same as readmitting Earth to the Council, but was the first legal acknowledgement in 4 years that humanity had a right to operate in galactic space. It was a small thing, a procedural accommodation, a careful, face-saving distance from the word asterisk mistake asterisk. The non-council systems that had filed the joint observational note, 47 of them, coordinated in a way that nobody in the council had expected non-council systems to be capable of coordinating, had sent a single representative to the session gallery as an observer, allowed only by a technical rule that permitted non-member attendance at open proceedings. He was from the Sulith Range. His name was Gareth Soldravani. He watched the vote from the gallery without expression. When it was over, Thesivane found him in the corridor outside, waiting, which suggested he had wanted to be found. "I heard your arguments," he said. "I know," she said. "They don't fully understand, do they, your colleagues?" He wasn't asking. "They think it's about the work, the operations, the number of systems." "Most of them," she said, "yes." "It's not about the work," he said. "My people were dying. Not slowly, not the kind of dying that gets called a crisis and scheduled for a committee. Quickly. Children. And the humans came in environment suits rated for conditions 3 levels below what our surface was running, because those were the suits available, and they worked in those conditions for 11 weeks. One of them went into respiratory arrest on site. They stabilized her, and she spent 4 days in our medical facility, and on the 5th day she was back out there because the project was behind schedule." He paused. "I asked her afterward, when everything was done, I asked her if she'd been afraid." Thesivane waited. "She said yes," Gareth Soldravani said. "She said she'd been terrified, and I said, 'Then why did you go back?' And she looked at me like I had asked her why the sun rose, and she said, 'Because the kids in Section 4 would have died in the flood.' Like that was the whole answer, like there was no other variable." He looked at Thesivane steadily. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes," Thesivane said, "I think I do." "The Council is going to vote to recognize them as a humanitarian organization," he said. "And that's going to feel like a resolution, like you've named the thing and therefore understood it. But I want to tell you something. I've been studying your galactic records for 3 years. The species that lost the most in the expansion wars. The species that were most brutalized by the boundary conflicts. The species that went through catastrophic resource collapse events. All of them eventually adapted by contracting, by deciding which parts of themselves to protect and which to let go. Every species, when the cost gets high enough, makes that choice." "And humans don't," Thesivane said. "I watched a woman go back into a toxic atmosphere 4 days after she stopped breathing," he said, "because the project was behind schedule, because children in Section 4 would have died. She didn't weigh it. She didn't calculate it. She simply went. And I've been trying for 3 years to decide if that's the most noble thing I've ever seen or the most terrifying, and I keep arriving at the same answer." "Which is?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Both," he said. "It is completely and permanently both." The Terran Auxiliary Corps formal registration was processed 6 weeks after the session. Elena Vasquez was listed as coordinating representative, a title that had no precedent in council organizational frameworks, and that the council's legal bureau had spent 2 weeks trying to find an equivalent category for before ultimately creating a new one. In the 6 weeks of processing, 3 more non-council systems had entered crisis and been reached by Terran relief teams before any formal notification reached the council's emergency assessment queue. The emergency assessment queue had a 40-day average processing time. Nobody in the council amended the processing time. Some things, Thesivane noted in her private record, take longer to change than others. The council was 600 years old. It had its rhythms, its architectures, its structures of comfortable delay. You could not rebuild it in a session. But the map she had built, the one that now existed in official record rather than personal files, was updated automatically by the Commercial Tracking Bureau as new operational sites were logged. She looked at it sometimes late in the day when the session work was done. It kept growing, quietly, steadily, in all the broken places. In the Karath Expanse, the stations that had been stabilized with human assistance had begun training their own emergency response teams, using techniques they had learned by watching. In the Drevani system, the secondary commercial circuit had grown sophisticated enough to include 17 non-council systems and handle trade volume that rivaled some outer council members. In the Sulith range, the agricultural restoration had produced its first surplus harvest, which Suldravani's administration had, without any coordination with Earth, without any formal protocol, without anyone asking, distributed to the 2 nearest systems experiencing food insecurity. Thesivane looked at that last data point for a long time. The humans had not told them to do that. Nobody had planned it. There was no Terran directive that said, restore Sulith, then watch Sulith restore its neighbors. It had simply happened because that is what happens when you repair something completely enough. It begins to repair things around it. She thought about what Vasquez had said. We have difficulty watching people die when we could have gone. She thought about Gareth Suldravani's face in the corridor. Both. It is completely and permanently both. She thought about the expulsion vote, 91%, 11 days, the fastest action the council had taken in its 600-year history. She thought about all the things that speed had revealed about what the council feared, and all the ways in which the fear had been both accurate and completely wrong. They had been afraid of what humans would do with power. It had not occurred to them to be afraid of what humans would do without it. She thought about a woman in a damaged environment suit, 4 days post-respiratory arrest, walking back into a toxic atmosphere because the project was behind schedule and because children in Section 4 would have died. She thought about that for a long time. Not with fear exactly, not with admiration exactly. With something that had no clean name in any galactic language she knew, which was perhaps appropriate, because the thing she was trying to name was also a species that had never quite fit inside any framework anyone had built to contain it. They had banished humanity to make the galaxy quieter. In the silence, humanity had gone to every broken place and begun to build. And somewhere, in 31 systems and growing, in the early dawn cycles and the long nights of atmospheres rated for conditions 3 levels below what the suits could handle, humans were still going. Not because anyone had ordered it, not because a strategy demanded it, not because the cost had been calculated and found acceptable. Because someone, somewhere, needed them to. Because for humans it seemed that had always been enough. It had always somehow been more than enough. It had always, in the end, been everything.